The Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't what most people think it's about. It's not just about borders or religion. It's about identity, and the narratives each side tells themselves about who they are and where they belong. Each story makes sense on its own, but they collide when they meet. What makes it even more misunderstood is that there are two overlapping conflicts, one between Israel and the Palestinians over land and statehood, and another between Israel and the wider Arab world, which represents a broader struggle over Israel's very place in the Middle East. To understand this all, we have to return to the beginning of these stories, which starts during the final years of the Ottoman Era, from the late 18th century through to 1917. At the start of the 20th century, this land was part of the Ottoman Empire, a small province on the eastern Mediterranean, home mostly to Arab Muslims and Christians, alongside a small but historic Jewish community that had lived here continuously since ancient times. For centuries, life was defined by family, faith, and clan, not by modern nations. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived side by side in towns and villages, connected more by local loyalties rather than by borders or politics. But the late 19th century was the age of nationalism. Across the world, peoples were turning into nations. Jews and Arabs in this region did the same. For Jews, nationalism became Zionism, the belief that Jews were not only a religion, but a people, seeking national sovereignty in their ancient homeland, biblical Israel, where their kingdoms, prophets, and prayers had long been rooted. For Arabs, Arab nationalism was rising, linking the people of this land, grounded in their deep connection to its towns and villages, to a wider Arab movement across Greater Syria. Two modern national movements arose, both legitimate, both powerful, and both claimed the same land. British rule, 1917 to 1947. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain and France divided its land. France took Syria and Lebanon under the French Mandate, while Britain took Palestine and Iraq under the British Mandate. The word mandate just meant temporary guardianship until the people of the land could govern themselves. During the war, Britain had promised independence to the Arabs to gain support against the Ottomans, but it also issued the 1917 Balfour Declaration, pledging to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. To Jews, this was long-awaited recognition of their right to return. To Arabs, it was a betrayal, proof that Britain had promised the same land to two peoples. In 1921, Britain carved off the eastern three-quarters of the mandate to create Transjordan, today's Jordan, restricting Jewish settlement there. That meant the remaining territory, the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, became the area known as the British Mandate for Palestine. In the 1920s and 1930s, Jewish immigration surged, driven by anti-Semitism in Europe and hopes of building a homeland. By the end of the decade, nearly 450,000 Jews, about 30% of the population, lived in the British Mandate for Palestine, a nine-fold increase from 4 decades earlier. New towns and agricultural settlements appeared, but so did growing resentment among the Arab population. Many Arabs saw Zionism as a European colonial project, arriving just as Arabs were fighting to end imperial rule. Violence erupted between Jews and Arabs, and Britain tried to limit immigration to calm the tension, angering both sides. Due to escalating violence and growing unrest, in 1937, the Peel Commission proposed partitioning the land, giving about 17% to a Jewish state, 75% to an Arab state, and keeping Jerusalem and its corridor under British control. The Zionists accepted it in principle, seeing it as a possible first step toward statehood, while the Arabs rejected it outright, unwilling to concede any part of what they saw as their own land. By the end of the 1930s, both Jews and Arabs had turned against British rule, and against each other. Independence and Catastrophe, 1947 to 1967. By the end of World War II in 1945, the horrors of the Holocaust had changed everything. The murder of 6 million Jews made Zionism a desperate necessity. Survivors fled to Palestine, believing only a state of their own could ensure safety. Britain, exhausted by decades of uprisings and war, handed the mandate for Palestine to the newly formed United Nations, which in 1947 proposed the Partition Plan, separating Palestine into two states, one Jewish containing 55% of the land, and one Arab containing 45% of the land, with Jerusalem under international control. Jews accepted, Arabs rejected. After the UN vote, for the next 6 months, tensions exploded into civil war between Jews and Arabs, while British forces still occupied the land but no longer controlled it. In May 1948, the last British troops withdrew from Palestine, bringing the mandate to an end. That same day, Jewish leaders declared the independence of the State of Israel in the territory allotted to them under the UN Partition Plan. The next day, 5 Arab armies invaded, launching a war that lasted about 8 months. Israel not only survived, it expanded from 55% to 78% of the land allotted under the UN Partition Plan. The rest, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, went to Jordan, and Gaza to Egypt. During both the civil war inside Palestine, then the Arab-Israeli War, about 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled, seeking refuge in nearby Arab countries. Most went to Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, while others ended up in Gaza, the West Bank, and refugee camps across the region. For Jews, it was independence reborn after 2,000 years. For Arabs, it was the Nakba, the Catastrophe. In the following decades, the world's focus shifted to wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, while the Palestinians, displaced and stateless, were largely forgotten on the world stage. Then, in 1967, a new war changed everything. Facing Arab armies massing on its borders, Israel launched a preemptive strike, and in just 6 days captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, Gaza and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. It was a stunning victory, but it left Israel ruling over more than 1 million Palestinians, turning a temporary occupation into a lasting moral dilemma. Holding the land offered security, as it gave Israel defensible borders, but also meant ruling another people, denying them sovereignty. The Palestinian National Struggle, 1967 to 1993. During this period, the wider Arab-Israeli conflict began to subside. In 1979, Egypt became the first Arab country to make peace with Israel, a deal in which the Sinai Peninsula was returned in exchange for peace. Over the next decade, other Arab states gradually moved away from war with Israel. For the first time, the conflict began to shift, no longer Israel against the Arab world, but Israel against the Palestinians. For the Palestinians, they felt the Arab states had failed them. Their fight would now be their own. Out of that realization came the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, based first in Jordan, then in Lebanon, claiming to represent all Palestinians, carried out terror attacks abroad and at home, as part of its campaign to destroy Israel. Israel struck back repeatedly, even invading Lebanon in 1982 to drive the PLO out of Beirut, forcing its leadership into exile in Tunisia, far from the people it claimed to represent. Within the occupied territories, daily life grew harsher, marked by checkpoints, curfews, and restrictions on movement. After 1967, Israel began building settlements, first for security, and later driven by religious and political motives. As they expanded, Palestinians saw them as clear proof that Israel had no plan to leave. By the late 1980s, anger erupted into the First Intifada, a mass uprising of protests, boycotts, and clashes. It was during this time, in Gaza, that the Islamist movement Hamas was founded, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, rejecting the PLO's secular nationalism and calling for Israel's destruction. From this point on, the Palestinian movement was split between Fatah, the dominant faction within the PLO that sought negotiation, and Hamas, which pursued armed resistance. The peace process, 1993 to 2005. The First Intifada showed that the conflict couldn't be won by force. As Israel sought to deal directly with the Palestinians and the exiled PLO looked to regain relevance, peace in the 1990s finally seemed within reach with the signing of the Oslo Accords, a 5-year framework laying the groundwork for lasting peace. The deal created the Palestinian Authority, PA, a new governing body to run local affairs in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, while final negotiations continued. The West Bank was divided into 3 areas. Area A, which had full Palestinian control. Area B, which had Palestinian civil control and Israeli security control. And Area C, which had full Israeli control. Dividing the West Bank and handing over partial control aimed at forming the basis for what was meant to be a gradual path toward full statehood. But mistrust grew between both sides. Hamas bombings in Israeli cities and settlement expansion in the West Bank eroded faith in the process. In 1995, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who had signed Oslo, was assassinated by an Israeli extremist at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. The peace process was left hanging by a thread. In 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton brought Israeli and Palestinian leaders to Camp David for one last attempt. Israel offered its most far-reaching plan yet, a Palestinian state in nearly all of the West Bank and Gaza, with shared control of Jerusalem. But mistrust, political pressure, and disputes over refugees and security proved too deep, and the summit collapsed. Months later, the Second Intifada erupted. Suicide bombings, Israeli incursions, and years of violence buried Oslo's hopes for good. Stalemate and War, 2005 to present. In response to Second Intifada bombings, Israel built a vast separation barrier, after which suicide attacks dropped sharply. Palestinians saw it as a prison wall. In 2005, Israel withdrew its troops and settlers from Gaza, hoping disengagement would ease tensions. Instead, a brief civil war erupted in 2007, as Hamas seized control from the Palestinian Authority, splitting Palestinian rule between Hamas in Gaza and the PA in the West Bank. Since then, Hamas's rule, committed to Israel's destruction and launching frequent rocket attacks on Israeli civilian population centers, has brought repeated wars and a deep Israeli blockade, leaving Gaza's 2 million people trapped between militant control, deep poverty, and recurring wars with Israel. In the West Bank, over 3 million Palestinians live under Israeli occupation and a weak, corrupt PA, alongside hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers. For most Palestinians, life means checkpoints, restrictions, and political paralysis. For Israelis, the occupation has become the status quo, defended as essential for security, but criticized both at home and abroad as a reality that cannot last. On October 7, 2023, the conflict entered a new and dangerous phase, as Hamas launched a surprise attack on southern Israel, targeting innocent civilians across different sites, from individual homes and rural communities to a large music festival, killing around 1,200 people and taking more than 240 hostages into Gaza. Israel responded with a massive offensive in Gaza. Airstrikes, ground operations, and a tightened blockade. One of the world's most crowded places became a war zone. Tens of thousands were killed, millions displaced, and Gaza left in ruins. The international outcry was immediate. Protests erupted across capitals. Even Israel's closest allies began to distance themselves, suspending arms sales, calling for ceasefires, and in several cases, recognizing a Palestinian state. Inside Israel, the war exposed deep divisions over leadership, strategy, and the moral cost of the campaign, with regular protests demanding the government bring the hostages home and end the war. In late 2025, the Trump-brokered 20-point Gaza plan emerged as a framework for ceasefire, hostage prisoner exchanges, a phased Israeli withdrawal, the disarmament of Hamas, and the establishment of a transitional technocratic governance structure under international oversight. Despite the latest plan, the conflict is far from over. It endures not merely because of borders or security, but because it is bound to identity. For Israelis, their state represents safety after centuries of persecution. For Palestinians, that same state embodies displacement and loss. Each story is true, each trauma is real, and together they make compromise feel impossible. The conflict isn't eternal but deeply rooted, and until both people see not just their own story but the others, it will go on, written in rubble and blood.